I have a couple of Magpie pieces that I am going to talk you through my creation process for today. Now, I started off one of these pieces with a rather unusual approach. I have this other painting that I did on wood at some point in the past, and I didn't like it. So I am painting over it. I like the branches. I love the crown up there. So I'm leaving that, and I have laid down some copper leaf with watercolor ground as an adhesive. And then I started painting over that with watercolor washes. Now I had already prepped this wood with watercolor ground, and so that's what made possible painting with watercolors on it. After laying down the initial washes, I started to paint sketch in my Magpie. And I'm sort of just doing this on the fly. I didn't really know exactly what the composition is going to be, but I have some rough ideas. And I'm just using the textures that are already here on the page to sort of, not page, piece of wood, to pull out what I want to see and to really shape my composition then. Now what I'm using here is white watercolor ground, and I am using that to sort of pull out my shape, the shape of the magpie, working into the negative space around it. Once that dries, then I can paint with more watercolor on top of it. And this is why I use watercolor ground instead of something like white acrylic, which I could on this wood. But with the watercolor ground, it means that I can continue to paint on top of it and paint more layers with it rather than have it as a watercolor repelling surface. And again, just adding more to the negative space areas, really fleshing that out and adding this little moon here. You might also notice here and there that I'm using a white gel pen. And at the end of this painting, what I do is I seal the entire thing off with many layers of acrylic varnish spray, and then a few layers of painted varnish, and then finally with resin. Darkening the magpie some more, just keep adding more layers of darker blue-black tones there to really pull out the richness of the color. But you can see how I really worked with what I already had on this surface. You know, sort of a repurposing of an existing painting and turning it into something that I like a whole lot better. Now this second piece is not from a repurposed board. It is from a brand new one, again on a piece of wood. And this time I'm doing it from scratch. So I set it up initially with some textures with the copper leaf and white watercolor ground, and then some washes of various blue and turquoise tones. And then I have to let that dry, and it takes quite some time between those first few layers usually because it's a lot of liquid that I'm using. The process that I'm using from here on out though is very similar to what I did for that smaller piece, even though it's on a new surface rather than a reused one. And again, I'm starting off with my magpie, painting it with a size 0 brush and using mostly Payne's gray, neutral tint, and yeah, some of these really dark neutral blackish tones, not actual black. I actually like using Payne's gray as sort of a cooler version of black, and then I have another one that I love to use. What is it? I can't remember the name of it. It is called Bloodstone. That's what it is. It is a more warmer black. I love using these instead of just straight out black because it has more of, well, depending on which one you use, you can either go for cooler or warmer look to it. So anyway, I lay out the initial shapes, these silhouettes of my birds, and I'm just painting these directly, no sketching or anything, just sort of on the fly and following what my instincts dictate in terms of their form and composition and flow. And you notice that I don't have them at the dead center of this canvas. I have them sort of off into the upper right quadrant, a little bit offset. And then I'm adding, well, I thought I was going to add another one down there, but then decided, nah, I think I'm going to leave it at 3. Although the composition still does feel to me like it needed something, which is what's going to happen later on with some of the other decisions that I make. Now I'm getting in a lot of the negative space again with more watercolor ground, again, so that I can continue doing layers on top if I wish. And I'm laying it in fairly thick, but blending it out towards the edges so that it fits sort of seamlessly. And then I took a wide flat brush there and just kind of whipped it over everything to blend it even with the darker Magpie shapes so that the edges are a little bit softened, not so hard edged. This way it all melds a bit more. This is ultramarine turquoise and lunar blue, 2 of my favorite colors, Daniel Smith, and painting more washes with those. You can see now I'm doing it directly over a lot of the areas that I hit with the white watercolor ground in that negative space. So this shows you in action what I meant about how I can continue to layer on top of things when I use the white watercolor ground like that. And again, I'm also smearing the Magpie shapes some more so that there is sort of movement and integration of them into the background. They're not just cut and pasted and just splat right on there, but they're more melded in with the surroundings and with everything else that's going on with the textures. Now, once all that dries, I finally take my smaller brush, my smaller fine brush, fine tipped ones, because I guess I was working with fairly small brushes initially, but they're not necessarily nice fine tips on them. Then I take these nicer brushes now and I'm going in and adding more specific foreground detail, really working in the actual highlights and shadows and shaping the patterns on these birds because they've got a very distinct coloration pattern in the way their wings and chest are. Continuing to darken the tail feathers with my small brush, and then adding a hint of some other colors to break up just the neutral tones of blacks. So I'm using a little bit of greens and blues and also blending out things. I didn't like that back wing, and so I just lifted it out. You can do that with watercolors. I just, especially with such a surface like I'm working on with the wood and the watercolor ground, where it's very easy to lift something. You can just scrub it with some water and it will come off. And then I could go back and paint it in a second time in a way that I liked. So that's what happened over there up on that upper bird. Now some of these other 2, again, I am adding more details, adding the lights and darks of the specific patterns on these birds, using white gouache there in this case, and then adding some more shadow with the darker colors. I think in this situation I was using mostly Payne's gray because I wanted the cooler tones of black rather than the warmer tones which Bloodstone gives me. And adding some highlights a little bit. I just, instead of using white right there on the back and the wing, all I did was kind of scrub it a little bit with my brush. Like I was saying, lifting is super easy on this surface, and so by doing that it just comes right off. And I go back and forth with adding details and then hitting it with some water in order to blend things out. You notice there I added a little bit more green again on both of these guys, just to add some variation of the tones, and blending back and forth. Water, details, you keep building it up, and as you go, as you keep adding water to them, what it does is it blends out and it sort of pushes what you've done further into the background, and it makes everything meld together better in a more seamless and softened way, so that there's no hard edges to anything. You see, I just kind of whipping my brush over the edges of everything to blend and spread out some of those dark colors around the tails so that it has this more foggy, blurred look to it. I didn't want these things to be completely sharp focus. I want them to be sort of eerie and ghostly in a way, and like they are these after images in your mind. Here I'm adding some more textural elements into the negative space. Adding these kind of shifting, shadowy presences, sort of like branches there. You know how when you look through trees, through the tops of trees, you get this sort of dappled look of sunlight coming through and blurred edges of the further branches and leaves and things. And that's sort of the effect that I'm after with putting in these sort of blended lighter areas. And then in these patches now, I'm starting to shape more distinct, larger areas into the background. And as well to add in some more darker as well. So I go back and forth. Sometimes I add light, sometimes I add dark. And just like with the birds, it's a process of going back and forth a lot with these things and seeing what you need and what will emphasize the textural results that you want to achieve the most. Also, what I am making sure to do is I always try to follow what is there, what is present already in the textural elements that I laid down initially from the start. In this case, it's the gold leaf and the actual physical texture of the white watercolor ground on the wood, and even the wood grain itself, which sort of shows through in places in the physical texture of the piece. And so all of this is something I take into account as I work in these seemingly abstract elements of the background. I follow what is present already and merely go through and emphasize more these shapes and shadows and forms. And so that there's a harmony that's created with the randomness. It's not necessarily me just implementing my will upon it, but working with it in a very collaborative way. And even in the way that the copper leaf has these crackles in it, and the paint seeps into those crevices and things. You know, I use those to try to create this sort of branch-like texture and form into this background. And this constant back and forth, this conversation of light and shadow that happens throughout the entire painting. And this development of the whole composition and the lights and the way your eye is led around the piece in the way that there's a rhythm to the light and shadow. What I'm doing here is trying to craft more of the shape of branches along the edges. Now I'm taking a very small size 0 brush again and adding these little red threads that these magpies are carrying. And with the white watercolor ground again, it's fairly thick, so it's like a gesso type consistency. I am creating a little bit of relief. So this is actual physical relief. It actually sticks up, you know, like a ½ millimeter above the surface of the painting. And I have to be very careful. I just get it very globby on the tip of my brush, and then I can deposit it onto my surface into this raised form. I've also taken sandpaper sometimes to this physical relief that I'll create with the watercolor ground and really shape it. I've taken like jeweler's files. I've done little white moths in this using this technique, and then sanded them nice and smooth, and they create a really interesting variation of and an interplay between the the light, the physical light that's reflecting off of the gold and copper leaf, as well as the physical texture of light and shadow off of something that is in actual relief form on a two-dimensional piece of art. More little bits to the red thread that these magpies have gathered, and some of the final small details on them as well. Letting the ends of the threads fade off. And I'm doing this while waiting for that relief to dry. Letting those leaves and the little circle and key have a chance to dry completely, because I don't want to do anything to them while they're still wet. So I'm being very careful not to touch the circle and the key, especially because those are much thicker, and so the relief on that takes a while to dry, much more so than these little leaves, which were not in relief. They were just flat. But I wanted a punch of contrasting color. Now, finally, because those little areas are dry, I'm using this Kohlner Maniatum gold leaf sizing. It's essentially gold leaf glue. It's sort of got this rubber cement-ish consistency to it, a little bit thinner than that. And like rubber cement, it stays kind of tacky as it dries, and it will remain tacky for about 24 hours or so. More than enough time for what I need when I am working with gold leaf. I usually wait about half an hour after I apply it, and I go off and do other things, just like I did when I was waiting for the relief stuff to dry. I just go off and work on other portions of the painting and do these little tiny leaf details, adding veins and a little bit of highlight to those leaves. Okay, good. Now the stuff is dry. Now I can do the actual gold leaf, which all you do is just stick it on there, and then I take some of the excess with my brush and use that to apply to all my little areas. That way I use pretty much every last bit of this gold leaf. I get people asking me, what do you do with the extra dust at the end? Well, the thing is, there isn't really much dust. It is so thin. Gold leaf is so incredibly thin that whatever doesn't stick immediately onto my gold leaf sizing when I slap it on there, all that little bits of the dusty bits, I just rub that in with my brush into all the little crevices and corners, and by the time I'm finished doing that, there really is nothing left. It all sticks, and so then you get nice, beautiful, shiny gold leaf gilded things. More little leafy veins down here. Coming on the end of this. It's surprising sometimes how long it takes to do just really tiny little things. Now, and here's the final little touches. I'm using a Sumi-E gold paint. I believe it's mica based, and just doing that along the edges to sort of, again, soften things. And I use it to sort of make the actual gold leaf blend better into the painting. And then I'm going around the outside of my key with some blues just to punch up the contrast as well, to make it more visible. And there you go. You can see the relief. You can see how it actually is raised and what effect that has when you look at it from different angles. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this today. Thank you so much for listening to me go on about how I created this painting. And I want to especially thank all of my Patreon subscribers, because those awesome people are the ones who make all of these videos that I create possible. And if you haven't had a chance to check it out yet, please do that. It's www.patreon.com/StephanieLaw.